Welcome to the Science for Sport podcast, where we dive into stories and insights that drive peak performance. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind the science of success. Here's your host, Richard Graves.
Hello and welcome to the Science for Sport podcast with me, Richard Graves. This week, we're taking a look at coaching through rehabilitation. So often in these instances, the focus is on the rehab itself. But how can we ensure that an athlete comes back stronger, fitter, better than before the injury first occurred? Well, this week's guest is Michael Carolan, a coach with nearly 20 years of experience working in high performance, strength and conditioning, and rehabilitation. Indeed, he's the senior lecturer and subject lead for sports rehabilitation at the University of Salford. So what are his thoughts? And more importantly, his experiences when it comes to rehab? Well, let's find out now.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Well, Michael, welcome along. It's great to have you back on the Science for Sport podcast.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
The eagle-eyed viewers and listeners amongst our audience have noticed I said welcome back, and that's because for those that listen religiously to our podcasts, you're on about 2.5 years ago discussing coaching elite sprinters at the time. In this episode, we're going to move the focus a little bit just to concentrate on coaching through rehab. But for those that perhaps aren't familiar with you or your history, bring us up to speed with your experience and how you've got to where you are now.
Sure. I'll talk about what I'm up to now and then kind of try and fast track and go from there. So I'm currently subject lead and program lead for sport rehabilitation at the University of Salford, and that is it's a BASRAT accredited course, and BASRAT is the British Association of Sport Rehabilitators and Trainers, and effectively they are the athletic trainers, or the UK version of athletic trainers, and they're part of this global partnership with the NATA, CATA in the United States and Canada, as well as other member nations like Ireland as well. So that's my relatively day job, so to speak. But within that, there's several facets. So I teach. I predominantly look after the kind of exercise and conditioning, strength and conditioning, coaching performance modules in second year, and then I try and kind of blow the brains out of the third years with kind of advanced clinical practice in the third year as well, bringing everything together. When I'm not doing that, we have professional footballers referred to us on a regular basis, and we've also got an ACL clinic and a humble ACL clinic. So I support kind of the clinical practices as well in that a little bit with my kind of more full-time staff in and around that. So that's relatively the day job, and there's lots of iterations and machinations within it in terms of obviously helping the students, supporting them, but also looking at how we can instigate clinically driven research, and then also looking at enterprise as well. So, links and partnerships with various individuals. So we've got work with Salford City Council and a company called Workwell to kind of try and help ease the burden of the kind of the MSK waiting lists across kind of the Greater Manchester area. And then we've also got a working relationship as well with Perform and the PFA, looking after kind of professional footballers and semi-professional footballers that are injured, and kind of getting them access to rehabilitation as well. My additional work is semi-difficult to describe. The easiest way to describe it is I'm a professional performance coach. In other words, sometimes people just try and put me in a kind of track coaching situation. Obviously my heritage in history working with sprinters, etc., leans into that a little bit, but it's more so around kind of consulting with various different individuals, whether that's from a military background, from I've got a guy over in Mexico who's going through ACL rehab at the moment, and then on the regular working with either youth athletes, professional footballers, or predominantly, which is the passion project because I was an athlete as a kid, working with kind of track and field athletes and predominantly sprinters as well. So it can be pretty chaotic, but it's really rewarding. I started out initially as kind of a track kid. I'd done martial arts as a kid as well, played a little bit of football, but injuries and kind of understanding of how to look after yourself and train often kind of led to frustrations and kind of, like big gaps in my career and things like that. So I studied at the University of Salford, completed my undergraduate degree there in sports rehab, then did my master's degree at MMU, looking at kind of biomechanics and sports injury and how that can feed in. And then I've done a host of different postgrad qualifications in strength and conditioning, weightlifting, nutrition, sports performance and athletics, because I'm never really satisfied anyway, and there's always rabbit holes that I end up going down. So I've got to be really careful how I curate that, because you kind of create work for yourself, which is probably why I've not nailed down a PhD theme yet, which is the next life project. But at the same time, it's something that I'm going to look at long term, and I don't know what that looks like just yet. So that's relatively me in a nutshell. As I said, I've coached, track and field athletes to national and international titles. I've worked in the British military as a civilian contractor, setting up a kind of a whole rehab pathway. Travelled across Europe and parts of the world with GB and England basketball, which was really cool, across different age groups, supporting them. Worked in rugby for quite a while as well, more on the therapy and medical side of things, but I eventually became head of performance for a semi-professional rugby team that punched above its weight. They kind of competed nationally against professional teams, which was really insightful and things like that. And I've always danced around different opportunities, turned down a couple of jobs in professional football just because unfortunately they didn't have the budget or wouldn't pay me. And that was quite tough, because that was always, when I was a kid, that was the career goal. So to kind of step away from that was tough, but I had to look at where I value myself in the market and what I do and what I wanted to achieve and things like that. So yeah, that's relatively me in a nutshell. There's probably other things I could talk about, but we'd be potentially here all day to some respect, and we need to get into the nitty gritty of why we're here.
Absolutely. And the first thing that springs to mind is that's a big nutshell that you've just described. A career that spans almost 20 years, vast experience across different sports, working with amateur athletes, clearly with your work with the council, as well as at a pro level as well. You must have come across various ailments, various injuries, various setbacks that the clients you've worked with have experienced. I wonder how, without going into specific clients and athletes, how some of those examples and instances have shaped your methods and the way you work through coaching in rehab situations today.
It's a good question. I'm mentoring a couple of graduates at the moment, and one of them, he's amazing. He's great to work with, but within this mentorship program, which is another job that I forgot to mention, what we've found is he's started to lean quite heavily on protocols, which is great. They're a roadmap in terms of how you might approach management with an athlete, or an individual. But my experiences have kind of taught me that everything is relatively bespoke. So you need your basic fundamentals, and if your basic principles are in place, so understanding how tissue adapts to load and things like that, so, and how you can coach someone through a particular movement, then you start to develop flex within your process to some respect, and you always have a frame of reference, which is why I often try and tell my students and anybody that I work with that you need to get miles on your soul. You need athlete patient mileage, whatever it is, and experience, and as long as that's being refined and reflected upon, and you're not just repeating the same thing that you do, then you will start to improve. And that's what I've kind of always tried to embrace. I think that's probably come from a little bit of the martial arts background, and also playing multiple positions in football, and then eventually becoming a coach in track, where you might have a paradigm with regards to, say, a technical model for sprinting, but you've already all of a sudden got an athlete that doesn't look like the athlete you've been working with, moves really differently, and you're trying to get them to self-organize and understand essentially the outcome as well. So I try and make it as bespoke as possible these days, but I do lean heavily on fundamentals and goals as well. So often one of my questions to every athlete or patient is, why are you here? What do you want to get out of this? And more often than not, athletes and patients can sometimes be quite frustrating. I had a conversation with someone recently who's seen one of my athletes, and they said that they've got this SI sacroiliac joint that's stuck, And I was like, that wasn't what we said. But often people lean on, the simplest thing that they can explain, and it's often either a syndrome or a diagnosis or something like that, rather than a complex melody of different things that have brought about that angry joint or angry tissue. It's relatively easier for them to explain, which you have to appreciate because they're not necessarily trained in this area.
How
So
important is that aspect of communication? Because I imagine in a lot of instances, certainly with athletes that aren't experienced in suffering setbacks and relatively serious injuries, that the focus is on the rehabilitation. How do I fix this ailment? As opposed to being able to continue to train and, in your sense, coach this athlete at the same time as rehabbing, so that by the time you get to the end of the cycle, you've got an individual who arguably may come back fitter and stronger than they were pre-injury.
that's, for me, communication is hugely fundamental, and I've often joked about the fact that I may end up one day doing a master's degree in psychology because, whether it's, the book Conscious Coaching, for instance, by Brett Bartholomew, and, some of the stuff that's been put out there by Nick Winkelman, and, in terms of coaching cues and types and things like that, the more I've delved into that, that's on the therapy and rehab side of things, that's definitely potentially a weakness of a lot of practitioners. And what you'll find is the practitioners that have been out there for long periods of time, you can tell because they're able to coach people through things, and there's a calmness within the storm. So if you think about an ACL, for instance, and again I mentioned my basketball guy over in Mexico. At first it was an absolute disaster, and the surgeon had him on crutches for 3 months and things like that. And I'm very much, don't worry about it. This is the process. This will be the program. This is the big program. It looks really scary. Here's your 4-week program. These are the key goals within it. And and I use him as an example because WhatsApp has been really useful for that. We will WhatsApp at, his midnight, which is usually around probably my midday-ish or something like that. But then at the same time, we'll also jump on a call. So it's usually about, say, between 6 and 7 o'clock into an evening when he just starts his day over in Mexicali as well. And often I'm not necessarily running the program, but I'm saying to him, look, these are the things, these are the nuts and bolts. You need to consider this. You need to make sure of this. And he sent me a message this morning saying, I'm trying to source this piece of testing kit. So an isokinetic dynamometer in terms of just, again, I want all T's and I's, crossed and dotted and everything. And someone's come back to him and said, no, we don't tend to, do that much. It's outdated kit. People use handheld dynamometers and they use force plates. And he said, Mike, what do you think of this? And I said, well, it's great. And force plates are great. Handheld dynamometers are great. Any kit is great, but it's how you use it and cluster that information. So I then went I said, look, just reply to them and say, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for, specifically around eccentric quadriceps, which is one of the key factors associated with, successful return to play. It's not the only key factor, because one of my retorts to the force plate side of things is, yes, you can get a great deal of data from it, but if you don't look at the movement strategy, then they might be driving that say single leg hop or counter movement jump from the hips or, from the ankle rather than say from the knee. So there's a lack of absorption through there or something like that. So they're developing, say, a stiff leg landing strategy, for instance. So, it's a key facet, being able to communicate things and probably be that kind of that calm or calming influence for the individual, because when an injury occurs, it can be a bit of a disaster. And athletes think, my season's out, I've lost however many months of training. And my attitude is that even if you're in a boot, or if you're even in a wheelchair, if you've got like a bilateral leg fracture or something like that, where's the nearest opportunity that you can, put your hands on a basketball, football, get some dumbbells, do some training or whatever it is. And there are famous quotes out there that essentially injury is just, and rehab is just training around an injury or training within an injury as well. Again, using the basketball guy as an example, he wasn't going to touch a basketball until the last 2, maybe 3 months of his program. And I said to him, no, as soon as you're in and around the gym, which was part of the kind of the basketball center, I said, you can stand there and do 53 throws. Yeah. So when you're having your rest,
Just get your hands on the ball.
yes, yeah, everything. If you're doing walking gait stuff, bounce the ball next to you while you're trying to do walking gait, and that comes as much from the coaching side of things as it does from the rehab, because what you're trying to do is, once you establish normal range of motion, normal tissue function, you're then looking at, okay, well, how can we now start to integrate this and give them a tertiary aspect that they need to consider and think about, because a lot of sports performance isn't just about force output, power output, speed of movement. It's doing those things fluently and efficiently while the body self-organizes around scanning, contact, perturbation, a host of different things. So the earlier you can kind of integrate that into your rehab process, the better, because you're not having to do it over a very, very truncated period of time, under pressure, and all of a sudden they become high risk of breaking down again. So yeah, communication for me is fundamentally number one. It's something that I met with the guys from the FA a while back, and they were even saying, look, if you can focus on something with your students, communication, how they coach, and coaching it's not just giving a set of cues. I want you to do, flex your hip, extend your knee, do this, hit the ground like a hammer. It's not that. It's all the little nitty gritty bits in between as well. So yeah, it's number one for me.
Given what you've just said, it suddenly brings to mind a question of how important is that psychological aspect, in the sense that, if you have done an ACL and you're a basketball player, then obviously you can't run around a court, but you put a ball in their hands, you can pass with teammates, you can throw a ball against a wall. So you have that, I guess for the sake of a phrase, you might call it game sharpness, because you're used to the skill elements of it. And also psychologically, if you're in that environment, you hear about athletes being stuck in a gym for 4 and 5 months and actually becoming depressed because they're away from their teammates, they're away from the environment that they enjoy and love and are passionate about. In this aspect, you're obviously not given the opportunity to play games, but they get the peripheral aspects of their profession that they enjoy and love so much. And I wonder, does that actually aid and increase the speed of recovery?
So when I spent three and a bit years in the military working with infantry, but special forces, some Navy individuals, RAF captains, etc. One of the things I found is that they would be pulled from duty as soon as they were injured. I started having conversations, whether it was with the colonel or the kind of regimental medical officer, so the head doctor on the camp, to say, actually, why can't we have them do, say, range duty, for instance? They've got a bad ankle or a bad back, but they can stand there and still, kind of help support their fellow soldiers become reaccredited, as long as they had the right kind of qualifications and everything like that. So it allowed us to do that. And again, what we found was that they didn't feel as disconnected, because often when an athlete becomes injured, to a coach or a manager, they're not useful. So essentially they can become ostracized quite quickly. And I can't remember the research, but a mental health nurse that I used to work with told me that it's actually 10 to 14 days of being injured where individuals start to display depressive symptoms. So, and then you get changes in diet, changes in physical activity levels, issues with how they perceive themselves as their self, and a segregation from that. And then if you've got a big scale injury of some kind, so you think about whether it's Musiala's ankle that everybody was posting about recently, or the 7 or 8 Achilles ruptures that happened in the NBA, all of a sudden you have someone that's at risk of not feeling like an athlete or a basketball player or even a military operative. So when I worked in rugby, we often, even if, say, one of the hookers had, say, a knee problem, I would say, you've got no reason why you can't stand on the edge of the pitch and just throw lines, for line-out practice. There is no reason. I will tape your knee or brace it. You can stand there and you can throw 50 arrows just repeatedly in. And more than anything, it prevents the kind of feeling of being ostracized, which is quite powerful. It doesn't necessarily speed anything up on a physiological level, but it definitely helps them on a kind of a buy-in, adherence, emotional level, in terms of the fact that they feel like they've got someone there that's got their back a little bit. What my biggest frustration with some people is that when they're injured, they're often pulled from everything, and it's, don't do anything, just rest, yada yada yada, things like that. I've got a friend who has some form of knee problem. He's down in Kent, so he messaged me and we were talking about it, and his physiotherapist told him to stop doing CrossFit and to rest and maybe give up CrossFit. And I was like, this is absolutely... And it's the antithesis of what we're trying to achieve in terms of rehabilitation and things like that. Even if it's and he thought it was a meniscal tear. So, and my perspective on that is, one, meniscal tears, even with surgery, don't have great outcomes. Actually, they've shown that it's around 50-50 in comparison to sham surgeries and things like that. And actually, conservative management has, a long-term benefit as long as it's done in the right way. But one of the worst things that you can do is say to someone, no, don't do anything. So part of whether you're a rehab performance coach, a strength rehab coach, sport rehabilitator, rehab physiotherapist, or whatever the titles are these days, because there's a plethora of them.
There are plenty.
So when my students, when they search for jobs, I'm like, don't search for sports rehab, or, even don't even search for physio. You've got to look at different, because there's so many different terminologies for it these days as well, and different countries use different terminologies as well. If you throw in athletic trainer as well, there's so many different terms that individuals can work in. So coming back to it, my thing about it is that really what we should be doing is empowering athletes to, like you said, come back fitter. So if they've got a lower limb injury, is there a deficit in their upper body strength, power output? Can they do some form of cardiovascular conditioning, for instance? So when Keely Hodgkinson was injured recently, I think it was a hamstring tear, I saw a video of her sat down using a ski erg, and she probably hated it. But for me, that is really, really good practice. It's really good rehabilitation. And again, with the military, I'd have the guys doing weird and wonderful things all the time, and even if it was just something horrific, if they couldn't load the Achilles tendon because they had a tendinopathy, they would still do something that would, raise their heart rate, test their RPE and their perception and their effort levels, as well as developing strength, speed, power, all these things. And over the course of my career, that's been a kind of quite a fundamental aspect of what I do and how I approach things. And I think for anybody that's either listening or interested, if you're on the strength and conditioning side of things, you'll be great at understanding training theory and coaching and things like that. Just start to learn about tissue. And then if you're on the therapy side of things, and that's where you're qualified, become a better coach and, get on the gym floor and things like that. And then hopefully things start to meet in the middle a little bit.
And I was going to say, before we wrap this up, because time's getting away from us a little bit as well, for be it professionals or coaches that work at amateur clubs, if you've got a footballer with a lower leg injury, in cricket, say you've got a bowler with a pec injury, something like that, what is your general advice in terms of how to help coach these guys back to fitness, how to aid that rehab?
I mean, first thing we probably need to do is you need to find, the point at which the tissue can tolerate some kind of loading. Okay, try and load the tissue as early as possible and as much as it will tolerate. So there's a big thing in ACL about don't do any extensions until X amount of date, even though that there are historical papers, I say historical because they were done back in the 80s and 90s, that show that the ACL, once it's grafted into place, is very, very strong, and it can tolerate a vast amount of load. And doing something like a knee extension actually doesn't load it at risk. It's just an assumption that's been created by some people that essentially didn't understand biomechanics, and it's been perpetuated from there, which is fine. But when you've got, and I think the work by people like Lee Harrington and Mick Hughes are doing in terms of trying to challenge that is really good, because, restoring quadricep function early on is fundamental to something like that. And the same again, say for instance, if it's a muscle tear, if it's a rupture, then you might need to follow some kind of, protocols from the surgeon if he repairs it, for instance, or something like that. And again, it will depend on the grading as well. So if you look at the BAMICH grading system as well, so if it's, say a grade C or even a grade B, they can be quite complex because you have some form of tendinous involvement as well, and tendons do take a lot longer to adapt to loading and change on a kind of a histological level than, say, muscle tissue as well. But again, that comes back to, we need to understand the type of tissue before we can then load it. But I am definitely a fan of trying to load something early, and whether that's just some form of mobilization, and then from there, there's been some great work by Alex Natera around isometrics, and again, Jill Cook's pushed that on a tendon-based aspect as well. And there's lots of other people that I won't be able to name drop within this, but at the same time, for me, the message should be, load it early as well. There's been some sports teams that have been doing, Nordics, even just isometric Nordics at like day 3 or 4 after a hamstring tear with no real, kind of like reactions. And I'm not the biggest fan of Nordics. That I don't think they're the be all and end all. But at the same time, again, they're a bridge to the next step of doing something else as well. So yeah, if you can load something early, as long as it's safe to do so, then yeah, definitely do that.
When you're dealing with your clients then, does it help or hinder you when you see pro athletes who maybe experience or have had a similar injury to the client you're dealing with come back in what seems a remarkable time, be that a pro footballer, or 12 months ago, I remember Aaron Rodgers, the NFL quarterback, torn his Achilles tendon or ruptured his Achilles tendon, and inside 3.5 months, he's walking, you can see him throwing balls on the field, and they're talking about, before the season's out, if the team made the playoffs, he might be eligible to play, which, I'm no expert, certainly not a medical expert, but 4.5 months to come back from an Achilles tendon injury seems astonishingly quick.
I often have these conversations, and what I often say is, you've got to look at the nuance within the situation. Sometimes you will get high responders, so people that will respond really positively to whether it's a surgical intervention or just healing and things like that. But it's also about optimizing the process as well. So is this athlete buying in 100%? So sleep, nutrition, recovery, hydration, micronutrient, macronutrient, all that kind of stuff, everything that fits around the process as well. And then at the same time, are we following kind of the basic principles that align with, obviously, getting the tissue moving and things like that? And then the other side of it is, has there been any complications? Now, some of that is based on surgical skill as well. So, if you have a great surgeon and they've had surgery to repair it or something like that, great. But at the same time, not everybody can access the very best surgeons in the world. And sometimes as well, even the best surgeons will still have a complication of some kind. So years ago, I had a world champion Aikido fighter who'd ruptured her ACL. And unfortunately, she just had complication after complication after complication. And she'd had 4 ACL revisions over that time, microfracture surgery, the lot. And it was just a shame. Eventually, she retired. I mean, she's happy now and everything like that. But at the same time, there is an element of luck. I don't like saying that because it's a little bit of a pass off. It's a little bit like, oh yeah, they're lucky. But there is a little bit of that where we don't definitively know whether things are going to work. But what we have to do is follow basic principles and go, right, what do we need to do today? And it's just next step by next step by next step. And as long as the athlete buys in, that's great. Sometimes you can get an overzealous athlete who they'll see something on TikTok or Instagram and they'll be like, wow, they're doing this, I'm going to do that. And it's like, okay, but they might have hit their markers earlier than you for whatever reason, so, excuse me, just going to drink.
Always well prepared, you see, water on standby.
Well, I get carried away. And then I'm like, what was I talking about? Oh, I'll lose my voice or something. So yeah, I'm always hydrated. But the thing is that they might have hit the milestones earlier. They might not have had a complication. With certain surgeries as well, there might be additional work that's gone on as well. So yeah, it can be quite complex. But again, often what I'll just reassure them. It's just always based on communication and reassurance, because yeah, the temptation is, and I've had the odd athlete say, I'm going to go to Dubai and get these injections done or this type of PRP therapy, and it can help, it can, but at the same time, it's the danger is the reliance on it. Stu McMillan and Dan Pfaff have often talked about, you know, if you get a plinth out in the middle of a track, or even at a rugby club, athletes will come and sit on it and they might want a rub, you know, a massage. And I've had this conversation with an athlete recently where, you know, sometimes you can become over-reliant on that as a cop-out to not doing the self-care that you need to do as well. So it comes back to that whole, well, you know, what's your sleep routine like? You know, how much blue light, you know, kind of exposure are you getting? You know, have you hit your, you know, your macros, your micros today? What's your hydration like? Are you at the end of your contract, or are you, you know, time pressured season-wise? Because stress is quite a bad thing in terms of, you know, being associated with healing processes as well. So all of these things mixing together, and you've got to be that kind of steady hand in the middle going, no, we're okay, keep going, keep doing this, keep pushing. And you do get a feel eventually for how hard someone has to work. Sometimes I'll be the bit of the drill sergeant and they'll be like, listen, we're going to have to mess you up today. This is going to be a horrid session. And then sometimes it's a little bit like, okay, look, you don't seem like you want to do this session today. Fine. It's going to bite you in the ass though. And you have to then step back and be like, kind of like, and they'll come to you and go, do you know what? I should have done that work. I can see why. And so it's a little bit of push and pull sometimes. And again, that comes a little bit with experience.
And it's building that trust between clients and experts, isn't it? Coach.
Yeah, and you've got to temper your emotions as well, because if you're doing a long rehab, you become invested. So you've got to always remain objective and pull yourself away a little bit, because their success is not really aligned to yours. It's nice, and I've been victim of this in the past, where I'll have an athlete achieve something and you virtue signal and you post something and be like, oh, this is amazing. And it's like, but really you're only part of the process as well, you know, and often their sporting talent is more thanks to their mum and dad and the environment that they grew up in and themselves than it is for you. Again, you're just a conduit to that. So yeah, I very much have to say, I don't know if you want me to swear or not, you can bleep it out, but I filter a little bit, you know. I'm like, don't worry about that, it's crap. Like when Game Changers came out, everybody wanted to go vegan. And I was like, yeah, eat some more vegetables and fruit. Great, I'm a massive fan of that. But you need some meat because of ABC, and they're like, what do you mean? And you know, I had loads of people try it, and then eventually after about 6 weeks, they'd be like, I either hate this or I just don't think it's sustainable. And don't get me wrong, if anybody's vegan and it's listening, please don't take offense. I'm not anti-vegan, because I'm always going to look at things, and I'm a massive fan of people eating more vegetables and fruit and things like that. But at the same time, again, I'm not a fan of polarizing towards one thing or the other. And that's the key message with this. So again, it's the filtering, it's the conversation, it's the coaching side of the rehab that I'm really kind of fixated on in terms of what I do.
Absolutely. Well, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we could go down so many more rabbit holes and explore in detail various scenarios, but we are out of time. Michael, I would love to have you back on the podcast and discuss this topic in more depth. But for now, where can our listeners and viewers find 100%. You on social media? I'm
on Instagram, MC Sports Rehab, and I'm on predominantly Instagram and LinkedIn. I might delve into TikTok, but I keep trying to shy away from it. I've never really been a fan of Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days. So yeah, they're my two kind of platforms that I work out of predominantly. My Instagram is just an easier way to, you know, put information out there. My LinkedIn is a little bit more professional networking and things like that. And again, you know, either my university email, which is m.d.carolan@salford.ac.uk, or my everyday email, which is mc_sportsrehab@hotmail.co.uk. Well, thanks once again for your time, Mike. We wish you all the best going forward, and we'd love to have you on sometime soon in the near future. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast. Many thanks to Michael for his time and sharing his expertise when it comes to the issue of coaching through rehabilitation. And if you found what he had to say interesting and want to learn more, then you can do so by visiting our website, www.scienceforsport.com. And if you've particularly enjoyed this episode, then please do feel free to share it with a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. Remember, the more downloads we get, the easier it becomes for us to attract top-name athletes or guests such as Michael leading their field onto the show.
Well, that's just about all for this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to the next time we can get together and discuss a little bit more in the world of science for sport.
Subscribe to the Science for Sport podcast now, wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more insights, resources, and to join the Academy, visit scienceforsport.com and connect with us on social media by searching for @ScienceForSport. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.